Santa Claus. Red suit. White beard. Rosy cheeks. Big belly. Warm eyes. You've seen this image your entire life. On Christmas cards. On department store displays. On wrapping paper and television commercials and the front of every holiday product sold in the Western world. It feels ancient. It feels timeless. It feels like it has always been exactly this. It hasn't. Before 1931, Santa Claus looked different depending on who was drawing him. He was tall and thin in some depictions, short and elf-like in others. He wore green. He wore brown. He wore bishop's robes. He was sometimes gaunt, sometimes severe, sometimes barely recognizable as the figure you know today. The specific Santa Claus that now dominates the global imagination, the precise physical proportions, the exact shade of red, the warmth of expression, the jolly corpulence, was designed in a studio in the early 1930s by an illustrator named Haddon Sundblom. Not for a church. Not for a children's book. Not for a tradition. For a Coca-Cola advertisement. And what Sundblom created was not a faithful rendering of any historical or folkloric figure. It was a product mascot, engineered to be warm, universally appealing, and, critically, visually consistent with the color scheme of a soft drink brand that needed to solve a very specific sales problem. This is not a Christmas story. This is a story about how a beverage corporation used a religious holiday, an illustrator, and 70 years of advertising repetition to permanently install a corporate image as a cultural archetype. To understand what Coca-Cola did, you have to understand what Santa Claus was before them. The figure has genuine historical roots. Saint Nicholas was a 4th century Christian bishop in what is now Turkey. He was known for gift-giving and generosity. His feast day, December 6th, was celebrated in parts of Europe with small gifts and traditions that varied significantly by region. The Dutch figure Sinterklaas, a corruption of St. Nicholas, was a tall, thin, severe bishop in red and white robes who arrived by boat from Spain, carried a staff, and was accompanied by helpers who threatened to kidnap badly behaved children. He bore almost no resemblance to the figure you know. In the 19th century, the American Santa Claus began to take shape through literary sources. Washington Irving's 1809 satirical history of New York depicted a pipe-smoking Dutch Santa. In 1823, the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, attributed to Clement Clarke Moore, though disputed, introduced the 8 reindeer, the chimney descent, and a physical description of a small, jolly, elf-like figure with a round belly that shook like a bowlful of jelly. This was closer. But it was still just one description among many competing versions. Throughout the 19th century, illustrator Thomas Nast produced dozens of Santa Claus images for Harper's Weekly. Nast's Santa was variable. Sometimes fat, sometimes thin. Sometimes in a red suit, sometimes a tan or brown fur-trimmed robe. He was evolving, but not standardized. The 20th century brought more variation, not less. Early Coca-Cola competitors and other advertisers had used their own Santa Claus images. White Rock Beverages had used a Santa image since 1915, a thin, more ethereal figure. The figure was in commercial use but lacked the consistency that would make it globally iconic. That consistency was what Coca-Cola created. Deliberately. For commercial reasons. Coca-Cola is the dominant carbonated beverage in the United States. But they have a business problem that market dominance cannot solve. Soda consumption is seasonal. In the summer, it is high. People drink cold carbonated beverages in warm weather. The association is intuitive and persistent. Winter was different. Cold weather suppressed cold drink consumption. Sales dropped significantly in the months between October and March. Coca-Cola had a revenue seasonality problem that no amount of market share could eliminate, as long as the product was psychologically coded as a summer drink. The solution had to be cultural. They needed to reframe Coca-Cola as an appropriate beverage for cold weather, and specifically, for the holiday season, the most commercially significant consumer period of the year. The strategy they chose was not direct product advertising. It was character advertising. Create an advertisement featuring Santa Claus, the most culturally resonant figure of the winter holiday season, consuming Coca-Cola. Doing so in a warm, domestic, joyful context that borrowed the emotional associations of Christmas and transferred them to the product. In 1930, Coca-Cola hired artist Fred Misen to create an advertisement featuring a department store Santa holding a bottle of Coca-Cola. It appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. It was the beginning of something. But it was not the breakthrough. The breakthrough came in 1931, when Coca-Cola hired Haddon Sundblom. Haddon Sundblom was a commercial illustrator from Chicago. Technically accomplished. He had the ability to render warmth and texture in oil painting with a photographic quality that photographs of the period could not achieve. Coca-Cola gave him a specific brief. Create a Santa Claus image for a national advertising campaign. The image needed to work in full-page magazine advertisements. It needed to appeal to both adults and children. It needed to be warm, joyful, domestic, and it needed to be consistent with Coca-Cola's existing brand colors, red and white. The red suit was not arbitrary. It was a deliberate alignment with Coca-Cola's brand identity. Sundblom Santa wore a specific shade of red, warm, saturated, visually dominant, that matched the Coca-Cola logo and label. The white fur trim echoed the white script lettering of the brand name. Every visual element was calculated for brand coherence. Sundblom worked on these images for over 30 years, from 1931 until the mid-1960s. He produced a new Santa Claus image for Coca-Cola's holiday campaign every year. Each image showed Santa in a domestic or public setting, delivering gifts, interacting with children, taking a break to drink a bottle of Coca-Cola. Sundblom's model for the face was his friend Lou Prentice. When Prentice died in 1933, Sundblom began using his own reflection in a mirror as reference. The face that became globally synonymous with Santa Claus was, for decades, a self-portrait. The images appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, Ladies' Home Journal, National Geographic, and eventually in point-of-sale displays, outdoor billboards, and store windows across the country. Every year. From 1931 onward. What Coca-Cola accomplished with the Sundblom Santa campaign was not creation. It was standardization through repetition. The company produced a consistent image, the same physical proportions, the same color palette, the same emotional warmth, and distributed it through every available media channel, every year, for over 3 decades. Repetition is how cultural images become archetypes. The brain does not distinguish between information encountered frequently and information that is inherently true. An image seen thousands of times in childhood is processed as foundational knowledge, as simply the way something is. By the time a child born in the 1940s reached adulthood, the Sundblom Santa was the only Santa they had ever seen in any nationally distributed media. The variations of the 19th century had been displaced. The thin bishops and the variable fur robes were historical footnotes. Coca-Cola had not created Santa Claus, but they had created the Santa Claus that the 20th century inherited. The campaign also succeeded in its original commercial objective. Coca-Cola sales in the winter months improved significantly following the introduction of the Sundblom campaign. The association between Coca-Cola and the warmth and generosity of Christmas, established through decades of advertising featuring the most beloved figure in Western gift-giving tradition, had partially decoupled the product from its summer identity. This is brand association engineering at its most ambitious scale. Not selling a product feature. Selling an emotional context. Borrowing the emotional weight of a religious and cultural tradition that predated the company by centuries, and transferring it to a sugar-sweetened carbonated beverage. Here is where the history requires precision. Coca-Cola did not invent the red suit. Santa Claus was depicted in red well before 1931. Thomas Nast used red in some of his Harper's Weekly illustrations. The 1920s white rock beverages Santa wore a red suit. Pre-Sundblom commercial Santas in red exist in documented advertising history. The myth that Coca-Cola invented the red-suited Santa is factually incorrect. It is also, paradoxically, a testament to how complete Coca-Cola's visual standardization was. The myth exists because the Sundblom Santa was so dominant, so consistent, and so widely distributed that people retroactively concluded it must have been original. What Coca-Cola actually did is more interesting than invention. They took a fragmented, inconsistent folk image and standardized it. They produced one definitive visual version and distributed it at national scale for 30 consecutive years. They made that version so ubiquitous that it displaced every competing version from public consciousness. The mechanism is not invention. It is corporate monoculture. The same process by which Heinz made one ketchup the only ketchup anyone remembers, and Campbell's made one casserole the only casserole anyone makes at Thanksgiving. Take an existing cultural element. Standardize it. Distribute it at scale. Repeat until the standardized version is the only version anyone can recall. The result feels like tradition. The process is brand management. The Sundblom Santa was an American corporate creation. What it became was a global cultural export. American mass media, film, television, advertising, and eventually the internet, spread the Sundblom image to every country in the world with a consumer economy. The red-suited, white-bearded, rotund Santa became the globally recognized symbol of Christmas gift-giving regardless of local folkloric traditions. Countries with their own Santa Claus equivalents, the Dutch Sinterklaas, the Finnish Juhlapukki, the British Father Christmas, saw those local figures gradually conform to the American visual standard. Not through legislation. Not through cultural mandate. Through the sheer volume of American media content in which the Sundblom Santa appeared. This is cultural imperialism through advertising. Not imposed by a government. Distributed by a corporation that needed to sell more soda in the winter. The scale of what followed is difficult to overstate. The modern Christmas retail economy in the United States generates approximately $1 trillion annually. The global Christmas retail economy exceeds that by multiples. The decorations, the cards, the licensed characters, the holiday packaging, the entire visual language of commercial Christmas, in most of the world, derives from the image Haddon Sundblom painted for a Coca-Cola advertisement in 1931. Coca-Cola receives no royalties on this. They cannot. The Santa Claus image is not their intellectual property. But they created the visual standard from which an entire global industry operates. That is a form of cultural influence that transcends any conventional measure of corporate impact. Saint Nicholas was a 4th century bishop. He gave gifts to the poor. He is the origin of a tradition that has been evolving, fragmenting, and recombining for 17 centuries. None of that history produced the Santa Claus that the world knows today. The Santa Claus that appears on 3 billion greeting cards every December. That children sit on the knee of in shopping malls across 60 countries. That dominates the visual identity of the most commercially significant holiday in the global retail calendar. That Santa was produced in a Chicago studio by a commercial illustrator named Haddon Sundblom. He was working from a brief provided by Coca-Cola's advertising agency. He was solving a sales seasonality problem. He was painting, year after year, the same warm face, eventually his own face, holding a bottle of Coca-Cola in a domestic setting designed to communicate joy, generosity, and belonging. He painted it for 30 years. Coca-Cola distributed it for 30 years. And 30 years of annual, national, full-color advertising repetition was sufficient to standardize a fragmented folk image into a global cultural archetype. The image on your Christmas card is not ancient. It is not traditional. It is not the product of organic cultural evolution. It is a corporate asset that escaped the corporation that created it and colonized the holiday imagination of the entire world. Coca-Cola wanted to sell more soda in December. They got that. They also accidentally defined what the most recognized figure in Western mythology looks like for the next 100 years. That is the most consequential marketing campaign in the history of advertising. And it was drawn by a man using his own face as a reference, because his model had died. Let us know in the comments what we should cover next. Thanks for watching.